Hello and welcome to our daily sketching routine. It is Saturday, February. It's already February the 1st, 2025, and today's topic will be figure drawing. I'm going to call it female standing pose in ballpoint pen. And yeah, that's kind of specific, but I'm going to start a deep dive into figure drawing. And I already have a figure drawing playlist, so if you want to just explore some more ideas before we get into all of that, welcome back if you're returning, and welcome if you're new to the channel. I sketch and post every day, and I use timers to stay focused and to build a habit. At first, I'm going to start a 10-minute timer just to get started. I find that it's been helpful to do that, to kind of focus on a topic for several days. There's always new stuff to learn with figure drawing. Also, the other thing is I don't usually sketch with a ballpoint pen. This is a Zebra 0.7 F301 ballpoint pen. You can use a pencil, like an HB pencil. So what I like about the ballpoint is it's kind of in between the felt tip pen that I usually use and a pencil. Just to start with, if you want to sketch along, a female standing pose that is like a front view and not too foreshortened or anything. So something kind of like this. And I found another one, and it doesn't really matter, because I'm not going to copy it exactly anyway. Just to get warmed up, I'm going to draw this pose again, but I'm going to do it right here, and I'll explain more. This is just a warm-up. So yeah, I wanted to just kind of talk about what I want to accomplish basically with this deep dive. So one thing is this idea of, I'm going to refer back to I call it the AOS triad, the Art of Sedone triad. So part of that is there's intentions built into that. So for example, there's imagination. So it's a triad. So there's imagination, there's study, and there's style, and they're dynamic. So they work together, they go together, but depending on your priority or what you're focused on or what your intentions are, will determine kind of the approach. So my approach tends to be drawing from imagination. So it tends to go in that direction. But that also involves studying, which is what the photo reference is for. And then it involves style, which is what using a ballpoint pen is like a style. The style is also drawing from imagination as a style, or life drawing, or drawing from reference or copying. So these are styles, or cross-hatching is like a style, for example. It's just stuff like that. But the point is that they're not static. They all go together. It just depends on the intention behind it. So this was just to warm up, but it's sort of kind of a preview of what I want to talk about. But as part of this deep dive, so I'm gonna keep using the sketch page, and that's part of it too, because one, a really helpful sort of test, I guess, is, can you construct a figure or draw a figure in any size, any scale? That's a pretty useful skill. So I'm going to kind of do that. As I'm looking at this page, I'm wanting maybe something like this, but here. So you should be able to put a figure right here and make it look kind of like that, in proportion. And then you could have like other stuff here. Like I'll do like a smaller one right here for this next part, like the new reference. So I'll put it here, and that's just part of composition. And also it's part of the fact that it's a sketchbook, so it would be really helpful if you could refer back to it and learn. And it does take work and it does take practice, but I think that if you can see or like work along with somebody, or if the information is sound, then it makes it more fun. I'm not too worried about the reference because I'm not trying to copy the reference. So that's this is about figure construction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a 1-minute timer, and that might be helpful in general, but it might be helpful if you have resistance to sketching, which I did. That's kind of how I got through an art block, basically. Also, the timer also helps like with resistance because it's just 1 minute. So if you're going to sketch for 1 minute, for example, the reason I kind of did this is like a thumbnail, is because it's good to kind of do like a thumbnail size. So I'll start a 1 minute timer. And I'll go over the proportions a little bit, not a little bit, but like a lot, but in a little bit. And so yeah, this is just a 1 minute thumbnail. And it seems simple, and it is, but it's a really useful skill and a useful approach. Now from a thumbnail you can actually develop a very detailed drawing, but we're still going to use reference to begin with. So that's a minute coming up here, a few seconds left. Alright, I'll make a note and say that that's 1 minute. This is not a bad exercise, by the way. So if you are, like I said, this is actually how I got through an art block. I mean, one of the things, it was a lot more than that, but as far as like sketching, that's pretty much as I could handle when you're blocked. You can actually draw something very detailed just from like the thumbnail, but we're not going to do that like right now. The next thing is still using the same reference, but we'll draw it a little bit bigger. And this time I'm not going to worry too much about setting a timer other than for the video, so I'm going to set another 10-minute timer, but I just wanted to do that to show you that 1 minute is still valuable and helpful. Now in this next one, this is the same size as like this one, and I wanted to do that to kind of show that there can be a lot of information even in a small sketch. So this is more than a thumbnail, but like a preliminary sketch is basically what it is. Now I'll kind of talk about like the proportions. So to be able to draw something like at a specific size and to fit like a specific composition, one, you need to know proportions basically. And the other thing is to not be too constrained by the composition, but like let it guide where it goes. So you can like adjust it. So in the figure drawing playlist, so you have like this center line right here. In the playlist, I go over this a lot, but we'll go over it again because one, I've also improved, but the information is sound though. If this is the center line and this is the midpoint, you can call it different things. That's just what I'm calling it. That's just what comes to mind. So like the center, and then like the middle of this. So yeah, I've gone over this before, but it never hurts to go over it again, just to see if it's actually legitimate. Just the basic proportions is, again, figure this out for yourself. This is just what I'm using. There's so many different approaches. Part of this is because of the style, and part of it is for character design and stuff and drawing from imagination. So I'm going to have like kind of my approach to it. This isn't meant to be life drawing or like photorealism or anything like that. So I just divide this in, like, find the midpoint there again. And if you're learning it, you're probably going to be a little bit more strict, but then once you kind of get the hang of it, you can be more gestural about it. And just speaking of the gesture, you can kind of get the gesture like this, for example. Like, this is the basic gesture of it, which is kind of like a standing pose, so it's pretty straightforward. You could start with the gesture, like you could just kind of look at the figure and just kind of, and then use like your knowledge. So that's why I'm starting with this, because you can just do it as a gesture, but if you're wanting to make it proportional, you would need to know like the proportion. So that's the constraint, like that's the measurement part to the figure construction. But you can see how it's basically the same kind of thing. Like that's like the flow of it. Maybe that's like another word for gesture. It could just be like the flow. And then once you get here, it's good to establish like the ground line right here. And so this is a mix of like gesture and proportion, but it's construction. And yeah, like I would recommend just working from reference until the construction part of it is memorized, because that's study. Construction is study. The style is more about like realism, like hyperrealism is a style, or like semi-realism, or stylized, or something like that. Or even like sketchy, being sketchy about it is like a style. So I'm just going off of like these proportions right here. And the proportions could be wrong, so that's why it's good to just experiment with it and see if it's correct or not. So notice that even though I have some guidelines, and that's why it's kind of suggested using a pencil, because I'm using a ballpoint pen, or like a ballpoint pen. It works well just so you can get the like the underdrawing going and go over it again. So I would say that don't fight with the drawing, but rather figure out like what is it about the drawing that's off, and you're going to get that from the construction. If a drawing's not going in the right direction. So you can cartoon this, which is what comics and animation is. This is a kind of cartoon. Like originally, I think that's the point of it, was that it was just the preliminary part, like the outline part. And you can make it, rather than saying make it more cartoony, maybe a better way to say it is like make it more simplified. So you could do that. I feel like this approach is sort of in between. My goal is to have whatever method I'm using which is what I'm using right now is like the methodology. I want it to be like 80% usable. Like I got to be able to remember it. I got to be able to draw like what I want. Like 80% of it is my goal. Which means, for example, yeah, I might have to do more studies or like look up reference or something. But it can't be so complicated that I can't draw like the stuff that I want to draw. Like it's got to be 80% effective. And I think that's why the Loomis method is good, is that it's 80% like useful, although you might have to adapt it like naturally. It's not going to work for everyone. It's not going to work all the time. It's not going to work for like every style. Like it doesn't work 100% of the time for me, for what I'm wanting to draw. But this approach, for example, to me, that's like 80% of the drawing right there. It could go more realistic or it could go more simplified. But yeah, like the gesture, you can see that it's the same. Either start with, this one was started with the proportion, this one was started with like the gesture, which then you apply the proportion to it. So these are approaches, but they're helpful because sometimes when you're like doodling something, when you're just warming up, you can get, it's just really about creativity. You can get some ideas this way, especially if you have something to look off of. But sometimes you could just be starting like a blank sketchbook page. Yeah, and sometimes like, especially like with character design, I think that's like a big part of why people use this technique, and like why I use it is because sometimes like a character will come out, because you're not always going to draw characters without costumes. So what I'm going to do is, like, once you get this much, so part of this is also so that your characters don't look like you're copying reference. So what I'm going to do is just use this, and then I'm going to draw a figure from like a study. But then I've mentioned before that it's helpful to have reference for things like lighting and stuff like that, like details. Like, I think reference is good for studying and understanding how to draw things. So this one was maybe, yeah, like 10 minutes, I guess. And this one was like a minute. So I'll put 10 minutes. And that's just because I was talking. It could be 5 minutes. But this will be helpful for like, how do you take, like, let's say you have these like little studies or like just sketches or doodles or thumbnails. That's why proportion is important, because then you'll actually know how to, again, like with the cooking analogy I like to use, then you'll know how to change the proportion, like literally. So yeah, like the proportions stay the same. The other thing would be, so part of why like using reference is good, or like life drawing, is to understand, like you have to just kind of, so these are like the basic proportions, but then also when does it look right? And that kind of has to do with the forms and like anatomy, which again we'll get into because it's a deep dive. There's like main proportions, but then there's like the smaller proportions. So for example, let's say I have this, then the next thing would be, well, how wide do you make it? So these are like the smaller proportions. So for example, if I have this, then it's mostly going to be rectangular, the human form. So by that I mean this part, which is like the torso area is going to be mostly a rectangle, and like the head area is going to be mostly a circle. And we'll get into like the anatomy of it later, but yeah, so like the legs, and I'm just going to use this as inspiration for like the pose. So the legs are going to be rectangular. So that's kind of what I mean about like square would, but like you can change that. It's kind of what I'm getting at, is you can make it more square, which I'm not going to do because I'm going off of this, but we can play around with that some more. So that's how you can get that kind of thing, like get the like I could give you, so there's different methods. There's the method of, well, count how many heads. Well, it's too much work, so it doesn't work for me. And that's what I mean about like the 80-20 rule that I like. If 80% of the time I'm not able to quickly do that, then it doesn't matter. So like a rectangle makes more sense to me than like or like the difference between a square and a rectangle, because sometimes the upper body will be more circular, that kind of thing. So that's easier for me to construct than, let's say, counting like how many heads, because I'm going to adjust it anyway, like at this part. Like it's not, I'm going to make it look right, in other words. So eventually, I've talked about it before, where you can draw stuff from just out of your head, like visualize it. Like some people have a harder time with that. I mean, it takes practice no matter what, even if you are kind of used to that. If I'm like talking and just, or like sometimes my mind isn't in that headspace where I can do that, then that's where construction comes in, because you can't always visualize exactly, especially if you're trying to design the character. You're not going to, it's difficult to try to design a costume or a character and draw correctly unless you know one or the other. So for example, I'll do like the construction, and then it'll start to imply like a character. Or I'll know what the character looks like, and I'll just start to draw like the costume or like the look of the character, and then use the construction to make it look how I want. I'll go into more detail about the figure, like what I'm doing, like the figure construction here. I'll go into more detail. This is just to kind of introduce the topic. If you want more, there's the figure drawing playlist. So what's good about this is that now it's not so much about like the reference, it's actually like you're drawing. That's the thing. It's now it starts to look like you're drawing of a figure that is in this pose rather than a copy of a reference. But yeah, the reference can be good for shadows, for lighting. So we'll get into that in the next several videos. We'll get into how does this help draw things up from imagination. One, that's where the practice kind of comes in. I mean, there's some things that if you don't draw for a while will still improve, and some of that has to do with the way you think, or like, yeah, like the way you see things. So that'll still be an improvement. But then there's other things that will be a hindrance, which is kind of memory will be sort of, you'll have to catch up on that. And then also like the hand-eye coordination, you'll have to catch up on it again. but it happens. I mean, sometimes you're not able to draw for a while, or maybe you can only draw for like 1 minute. What I'm going to do is keep working on this page. So tomorrow I'll come back to this. You might want to kind of work on something like this in the meantime if you want. And I'll kind of go into more detail tomorrow, and then yeah, next week will be a deep dive. We'll do like a back view, we'll do different poses like sitting or standing, reclining, like moving for shortened. So yeah, I want to thank you for joining me for today's sketching routine, and if you enjoy these videos, hopefully you come back and support the channel. I appreciate it, and until next time, keep on sketching.